Michael Deo's fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of code streaming onto the monitor. The harsh glow of the screen illuminated his face in the dimly lit home office, casting sharp shadows that accentuated the firm set of his jaw. He glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m. Another late night, but the software project demanded nothing less. A notification popped up on his screen. Conference call in 13 minutes. Michael sighed, rubbing his eyes. The constant juggling of deadlines and meetings was wearing, but he prided himself on his ability to stay focused and push through. It was this same determination that had propelled him through his career, earning him a reputation as a brilliant, if somewhat cold, software engineer. He was about to reach for his headset when the doorbell rang. Michael frowned. Who could be calling at this hour? Elena, his wife, was at some faculty dinner, or so she'd said. Maybe she'd forgotten her keys again. He stretched as he made his way to the front door. He opened it, expecting to see Elena's apologetic smile. Instead, he found himself face to face with a young woman he'd never seen before. Her eyes blazed with fury. Her whole body was tense. The girl was so angry she barely spoke before thrusting a stack of photos at Michael. They scattered, falling to the ground and landing at his feet. She told him, her voice trembling with emotion, to tell his wife to stay away from her boyfriend. Michael blinked, momentarily stunned. He bent down, picking up one of the fallen photos. As his eyes focused on the image, he felt as if the ground had suddenly dropped away beneath him. There was a vividness to it. The photo showed Elena, locked in an intimate embrace with a young man. He looked like a student. The girl, Ashen, continued to titrate, but Michael barely heard her. His mind was processing the information with the same cold logic he applied to debugging complex code. Each photo he picked up was another piece of damning evidence, another blow to the life he thought he knew. Michael's voice was quiet and controlled, betraying his emotions. Ashlyn paused mid-rant, taken aback by Michael's calm demeanor. How long has this been going on? Michael repeated, his eyes never leaving the photos in his hand. Ashlyn spat, at least since the beginning of the semester, maybe longer. Michael held up a hand, cutting her off. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, he said, his tone formal and detached. I'll handle it from here. Ashlyn, he stood there, mouth agape, clearly expecting a different reaction. That's it. You're not going to. I said I'll handle it, Michael repeated, his voice taking on an edge of steel. Good night. He closed the door, leaving a bewildered Ashlyn on the porch. Inside, Michael leaned against the door, taking deep breaths. The conference call notification chimed again on his computer, ignored for a long moment. Michael stood there, the photos clutched in his hand. Then, he walked back to his office, sat down at his desk and began to scan the photos one by one, saving them to a secure folder on his computer. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and in that moment, Michael made a decision. This betrayal would not go unanswered. Elena had made her choice, and now she would face the consequences. With cold precision, Michael composed an email to the university's ethics committee and attached the scan. He took the photos and wrote a quick note about how he'd got them. He hesitated for a second before pressing send. That was done. He leaned back in his chair, already thinking about what he'd do next. He felt a dull pain in his chest, but he pushed it aside. He'd deal with that later. He glanced at the clock. It was 10. It's 23 p.m. It was 10:23. Elena wouldn't be home for hours yet, which was good because it meant he had time to prepare as the night wore on. Michael threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, turning lines of code into a refuge where logic reigned supreme and emotions had no place. By the time he heard Elena's key in the lock sometime after midnight, he had regained his composure entirely. She called out She greeted him, her voice slightly slurred. The faculty dinner must have involved plenty of wine. Michael didn't respond, remaining in his office with his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. Elena appeared in the doorway, her cheeks flushed. Michael, did you hear me? I'm home. He turned to look at her, his face impassive. I heard something in his tone that made Elena pause. Everything okay? Michael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Everything's fine. How was your dinner? Oh, you know the usual academic politics and posturing, Elena said with a laugh. Michael nodded and turned back to his computer as Elena's footsteps faded down the hall. He allowed himself a small, grim smile, He knew she was trying to get to sleep, but he was worried about her. He knew that tomorrow her world would begin to crumble. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a beautiful Chicago spring. The day seemed to mock the storm brewing inside the Dean household. Michael had risen early, brewing a pot of coffee and settling in the kitchen with his laptop. He was midway through his second cup when he heard Elena's phone chirp with an incoming email. Moments later, a scream of rage echoed through the house. Michael took another sip of his coffee. Elena came tearing into the kitchen, her hair wild and still in her nightgown. "What the hell have you done?" she shrieked, waving her phone in Michael's face. "You sent those photos to the university." Michael sat down slowly, deliberately, and placed his coffee cup on the table. "I did what I had to," he said in a calm voice. "You crossed the line." Elena's face paled, then flushed with anger. "You'll face the consequences," she said. Elena's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "It was just a fling," she protested. "How could you do this to me, to us?" Michael repeated, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "There is no us anymore. Elena, you saw to that when you decided to sleep with one of your students. You don't understand." Elena pleaded, her tone shifting from anger to desperation. She said, "I never meant for it to happen. We can work through this, can't we? For God's sake, Michael, we've been married for 15 years. Michael stood in his chair, scraping against the tile floor. 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years of trust, of building a life together, and you threw it all away for what, a quick thrill with a boy barely out of his teens? The boy was barely out of his teens. And Elena flinched at his words. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Michael. Please, we can fix this. Just tell the university it was a mistake. Say you were angry and acted rashly. We can still salvage this." Michael shook his head. His eyes were cold. "Elena, we can't. This is just the beginning. You made your choice and now you'll live with it." "You bastard," Elena hissed, her desperation turning to fury. "If that's how you want to play it, fine. I'll file for divorce. I'll take you for everything you've got." She smiled humorlessly at the corners of Michael's mouth. "Go ahead," he said softly. "Try." Elena stared at him, seeing the extent of his determination for the first time. This wasn't a man acting out of hurt or anger. This was calculated and planned. She took a step back, suddenly afraid of what he'd done. Michael picked up his coffee cup and took another sip before answering. "I've simply set things in motion. The university's ethics committee has the photos. They'll conduct their investigation, and when they do, they're not just going to find one indiscretion with a student, are they?" Elena's face fell. "You can't know. You have no proof. Don't I have a point? It's amazing what people are willing to share when they feel betrayed. Did you really think you could keep it all hidden forever?" "You'll destroy my career," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael shrugged. "You destroyed it yourself. I'm just making sure the right people know about it." Elena lunged forward, her hand raised to strike, but Michael caught her wrist easily. "Don't," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "You've already made enough mistakes. Don't add assault to the list." He released her arm, and Elena stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. "I hate you," she sobbed. "That's your prerogative." "If you excuse me, I have work to do," Michael replied calmly, gathering his laptop and coffee, and leaving Elena standing in the kitchen, her world collapsing around her. As he walked to his home office, Michael allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The first blow had been struck, and now he could prepare for the next phase of his plan. The next part of his plan was to get on with his work. He used the complex coding problems as a shield against the emotional turmoil threatening to overwhelm him. Every so often he'd hear Elena's muffled sobs or angry phone conversations from elsewhere in the house, but he tuned them out and focused on the task at hand. By late afternoon, he was able to block out the noise. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Ashlyn, the girl from the night before. He'd heard that Elena had been suspended pending investigation. He thought you'd want to know. Michael stared at the message for a long moment before typing out a reply. "Thank you for the information. How did you hear about this?" Michael filed this information away. Ian, the student in the photos. He could be a valuable source of information or a dangerous loose end. Either way, he was someone to keep an eye on as the evening fell. Michael emerged from his office to find Elena packing a suitcase. She glared at him as he entered the bedroom. "I'm staying with my sister for a while," she announced, her voice hoarse from crying. "I can't be in this house with you right now." Michael nodded, probably for the best. When he got to the office, he found Elena packing a suitcase. She glared at him as he came in the bedroom. "I'm staying with my sister for a while," she announced, her voice hoarse from crying. "I can't be in this house with you right now," Michael said. "Probably for the best," Elena replied, zipping up her suitcase with more force than necessary. "You've made a powerful enemy, Michael. This isn't over. You've simply revealed the enemy that was always there, hiding behind a facade of love and trust. I've simply revealed the enemy that was always there, hiding behind a facade of love and trust," Michael replied, his voice tired but firm. "You know I always admired your focus and drive," she said quietly. "I never thought you'd turn it against me like this, and I never thought you'd betray everything we built together." Michael countered, "I guess we both learned something about each other." With a final look of pain, Elena left the room. A few minutes later, Michael heard the front door slam. He went to the window and watched as Elena's car pulled out of the driveway and drove off down the street. Left alone in the suddenly quiet house, Michael allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He sank onto the bed and put his head in his hands. He took a few deep breaths to calm down. The pain he'd been holding at bay threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it down. He'd have time for grief later. Now he had work to do. Michael pulled out his phone and dialed a number. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. It was Gavin Henley. "Office, Mr. Henley," Michael said. His voice was steady. "My name is Michael Deo. I'm looking for a divorce lawyer. I've heard you're the best in the business when it comes to complicated cases." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I heard some interesting rumors today about a certain University of Chicago professor. I don't suppose that has anything to do with your call." "It might," Michael answered. "Do you have time to meet tomorrow? I think we have a lot to discuss for a case like this." "I'll make time," Gavin said. "My office 9000 a.m. Bring everything you've got, I'll be there." Michael confirmed, ending the call. He walked to the window again. The street outside was quiet and peaceful, but Michael knew that beneath the calm surface, a storm was brewing. Elena had made her move, thinking she held all the cards. Now it was his turn, and he intended to play this game to win. As KN fell over Chicago, Michael Deo stood at the precipice of a new chapter in his life. The man who entered his home office that evening was not the same one who had left it that morning. He was harder and colder. The betrayal had carved something out of him. He left behind a void that could only be filled by one thing: retribution. Michael sat at his desk, opened his laptop and began to plan. He was a foot in, and he intended to see it through to its bitter end. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Michael's home office, casting long shadows. Across the room, Michael sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, listening intently to the voice on the other end. "I've reviewed the evidence you've provided," Mr. Deo said. "I must say it's quite damning." Michael's lips curled into a cold smile. "Mr. Henley, I think there's more to uncover. I can tell Gavin's interested. Let's talk about it in person," Michael replied. "Let's just say Elena's indiscretions may not be limited to this one student." Gavin mused. "Well, Mr. Deo, I think we have the makings of There's a strong case here. Your wife's career is effectively over, and with this evidence we can ensure she gets nothing in the divorce settlement." Michael nodded, even though Gavin couldn't see him. "That's exactly what I want. How soon can we file? I can have the papers drawn up by the end of the week. But remember, this is just the start. Elena is likely to fight back hard, so let her try," Michael said, his voice cold. "I'll be ready." He ended the call, and a notification popped up on his computer screen. It was an email from the university's ethics committee requesting his presence at. Later that week, Michael's eyes narrowed as he read the message. Things were moving fast, more quickly than he'd anticipated. Just then, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ashlyn. "Can we meet? I have more info about Elena and Ian." Michael considered for a moment before replying. "Coffee shop." He got in his car and drove to Maine, arriving at the coffee shop just outside of town about 30 minutes later. He chose a secluded booth in the back. Ashlyn walked in a few minutes later, her eyes darting nervously around the room before spotting Michael as she slid into the booth across from him. Michael studied her, recalling their first encounter. The encounter had been replaced by a mix of determination and anxiety. "Thanks for meeting me," Ashlyn said, her voice low. "I wasn't sure you would," Michael replied, leaning back in his chair with an impassive expression. "You said you had information." "I'm listening," Ashlyn said, taking a deep breath. "It's worse than we thought. Elena and Ian." "It wasn't. It was just a fling, but it's been going on for months." She hesitated, glancing around before continuing. "I think there might have been others before Ian." Michael's eyebrows raised slightly. "You're sure about this?" Ashlyn nodded vigorously. "Ian, he talks in his sleep sometimes. He mentioned names, dates, and are there any concrete rumors among the students?" Michael finished, leaning forward with an intense look on his face. "Ashlyn, I need you to tell me everything you know, every detail, no matter how small." For the next hour, Ashlyn shared a lot of information, including text messages that had been overheard. All the conversations and campus gossip pointed to a pattern of behavior that went far beyond a single indiscretion. As Ashlyn talked, Michael's mind raced, fitting the pieces together. When she finally fell silent, he sat back and processed everything he'd heard. "Thank you, Ashlyn," he said after a long moment. "I can help with that." Ashlyn shifted in her seat, looking at her coffee cup. "What are you planning to do?" Michael's eyes met hers, and she flinched at the coldness she saw there. "What needs to be done?" As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Ashlyn hesitated. "Michael, I know we're doing this for different reasons, but I'm glad." "You're making her pay." Michael nodded. His face was unreadable. "Justice comes in many forms. Ashlyn, sometimes it has to be cold back at home." Michael threw himself into his work, using the complex coding problems as a shield against the turmoil of his personal life. Hours passed in a blur of algorithms and data. Structures. It was late afternoon when the doorbell rang. Michael frowned, not expecting any visitors. He opened the door to find Elena standing there, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past him into the house. Michael closed the door and turned to face his soon-to-be ex. "Elena, I thought we'd already talked about this." "Michael, I wasn't aware we had anything left to discuss." "Elena, you're trying to destroy me. I know what you're doing. The ethics committee, the divorce filing. You're trying to ruin my career." "Michael, I'm simply ensuring that your actions have consequences." Michael's voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath it. He said, "I think the question is, do you have any idea what you've done? Did you think about consequences when you were sleeping with your students?" Elena flinched as if she'd been slapped. She said, "It wasn't like that. You don't understand. Then explain it to me." Michael interrupted. "Elena, can you explain how this wasn't a betrayal of everything we built together? And how it wasn't an abuse of your position?" "I made a mistake." "Michael, you can't just throw away 15 years of marriage over one stupid error in judgment. I think this wasn't an isolated incident." The color drained from Elena's face. "What are you talking about?" "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Michael said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Ian wasn't the first, was he?" Elena stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock. "How did you find out?" "It doesn't matter. I know." Michael cut her off. "What matters is that I do know. Soon, we'll have to report this to the ethics committee," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, Michael. I'll do anything we can to work this out. Can't we just put the past behind us?" For a moment, Michael's eyes showed a hint of the love that had once bound them together. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold determination. "There's nothing left. You made your choices, Elena. Now you have to live with them." Elena's pleading expression hardened into one of rage. "Fine," she hissed. "If that's how you want to play it, so be it. But remember this, Michael. You started this war. Don't be surprised when I fight back." She stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Silence fell after he'd had a heart-to-heart with himself. He'd known this confrontation was coming, but the reality of it left him feeling drained. He walked to his office, sinking into his chair. His eyes fell on a framed photo on his desk, him and Elena on their wedding day, both smiling, full of hope for the future. With a swift motion, he knocked the frame face down. The next few days, Michael met with Gavin Henley to finalize the divorce filing. He spent the day going over financial records and legal documents and preparing for the University Ethics Committee hearing, where he was going to present the evidence he'd gathered. The next day was bright and clear, and Michael was dressed in a suit he'd chosen carefully. He picked out a dark suit that seemed to say he was serious and reliable as he nodded at his tie. He looked in the mirror and saw that he looked older and more serious than he had just a week ago. The university campus was busy as he made his way to the administration building. As he walked, Michael could feel eyes on him. He heard whispers following in his wake. News of the scandal had spread quickly in the waiting area outside the hearing room. Michael spotted Elena sitting with her lawyer. Their eyes met briefly before Elena looked away. Her face was pale and drawn. A door opened, and a stern-looking woman emerged. It was Mr. Deo, who was calling the committee to order. Michael stood straight, smoothing out his jacket as he walked into the hearing room. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This was the moment everything would change. The ethics committee members sat behind a long table. Michael looked at their faces. Michael took his seat, looking serious as the chairwoman, Dr. Evelyn Reeves, cleared her throat. "Mr. Deo, thank you for coming. We know this must be tough for you." Michael nodded, his face a mask of composure. Over the next hour, Michael presented his evidence, including the photos, text messages, and testimony he'd gathered from Ashen and others. He spoke clearly and concisely, controlling his emotions as he finished. Dr. Reeves leaned forward and said, "Mr. Deo, these allegations are extremely serious. You understand the impact this could have. I know it could affect Professor Deo's career." "I do," Michael replied, his voice steady, "but I also understand the impact her actions have had on her students, on the integrity of this institution, and on our marriage. Actions have consequences, Dr. Reeves. I'm simply ensuring those consequences are faced." The committee members exchanged glances. He gave a few slow, deliberate nods. "Thank you, Mr. Deo. We'll take your testimony under advisement. Professor Deo will have an opportunity to respond." As Michael left the hearing room, he found Elena waiting outside. Her lawyer was speaking to her in low, urgent tones, but she brushed him off as Michael approached. "How could you do this?" she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "You've just destroyed everything I've worked for." Michael met her gaze evenly. "No, Elena. You destroyed it yourself. I'm just making sure the truth comes out." Elena's lawyer stepped between them. "Mrs. Deo, I must advise you not to speak to your husband without. I'm here." "Oh, save it," Elena snapped. She turned back to Michael, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over. Michael, you think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming." As Elena stormed off, her lawyer hurried after her. Michael felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Riley Kane, one of Elena's colleagues, standing there. "Mr. Deo, I'm Riley Kane. I think we need to talk." Michael raised an eyebrow, wondering what Professor Kane would have to say. Riley glanced around nervously, then suggested they go somewhere more private. They found an empty classroom and closed the door behind them. Riley took a moment to collect himself before turning to Michael. "I've suspected for a while." He said that he'd suspected for a while that Elena was involved with students. His voice was low, but he'd never had proof until now. Michael's eyes narrowed. Riley took a deep breath. "There was an incident last year when a student came to me, hinting at an inappropriate relationship with the professor. She wouldn't name names, but I had my suspicions. I reported it. I reported it to the department head, but without concrete evidence, nothing came of it." "Do you think that Professor Elena was involved?" Michael asked. Riley nodded. "I'm almost certain of it, and I don't think it was an isolated incident." Michael felt a cold anger building inside him. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "It's the right thing to do." "I thought you should know," Riley said, meeting Michael's gaze. "To be honest, I'm worried about what Elena might do next. She's always been ambitious and ruthless. I wouldn't put it past her to try and turn this around on you somehow." Michael considered this for a moment. "Thank you, Professor Kane. Your information is very helpful." He left the campus feeling like he'd made some progress, but he still had this feeling that Elena had more tricks up her sleeve. He needed to be prepared for whatever came next. That evening, as Michael sat in his home office going over the day's events, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at Lakefront Park in an hour. Come alone." Michael stared at the message, his brow furrowed. Ian had reached out, which was unexpected and potentially dangerous. However, it could also be an opportunity to gather more information. After a moment's hesitation, Michael replied with a simple "okay" and added an hour. Later, Michael found himself walking along the shore of Lake Michigan. The park was mostly deserted at this hour, with the Chicago skyline twinkling in the distance. He spotted Ian sitting on a bench, hunched over his knee, bouncing nervously as Michael approached. Ian looked up, his face a mix of fear and defiance. Ian said, his voice shaky, "Thanks for coming." Michael sat down next to him, keeping a careful distance. "You wanted to talk to me, Ian, so talk." Ian ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "I know you must hate me, and I get it. I do, but you have to understand Elena. She's not who you think she is." Michael's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly do I think she is?" "She's manipulative," Ian said, his words coming faster now. "She makes you feel special, like you're the only one who understands her, but it's all a game to her. I wasn't the first, and I doubt I'll be the last." "How many others were there?" Michael asked, his voice cold. Ian shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but there were rumors that you know about other students, maybe even other professors. Elena likes power and likes control." Michael absorbed this information, his mind working to fit it into the larger picture he was building. "Why are you telling me this now, Ian? Why not come forward earlier, Ian?" He laughed bitterly. "Are you joking? I was terrified, to be honest. Elena made it clear what would happen if I ever talked, but now I don't know. It feels like everything's falling apart anyway. Might as well tell the truth." As Ian spoke, Michael noticed his hand shaking and his eyes darting around nervously. "Ian," he said, his voice softer now. "Are you okay?" Ian's laugh had an edge of hysteria to it. "Okay, no, Mr. Deo, I'm pretty far from okay. I can't sleep. I can't eat. Ashlyn's sending me these angry messages. I just don't know what to do anymore." Michael studied the young man before him, feeling a mix of pity and... Ian was clearly on the edge, a liability to himself and potentially to Michael's plans. "Listen to me, Ian," Michael said, his voice firm but not unkind. "What happened between you and Elena was wrong, but it doesn't have to define the rest of your life. You need to pull yourself together." Ian looked at him, desperation in his eyes. "How my future is ruined if this gets out. I don't have to tell the ethics committee everything I know. If you're honest and show remorse, there's a chance you can salvage your academic career." Ian hesitated, clearly torn. "Elena, you can worry about that." "Elena," Michael said, his voice hardening. "You focus on getting your life back on track." As they parted ways, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Ian was a ticking time bomb. He made a mental note to keep a close eye on the situation the next morning. Michael woke up to a flurry of missed calls and messages from the university. Elena had been placed on administrative leave while further investigation was carried out. As he scrolled through the news articles already popping up online, Michael's phone rang. It was Gavin Henley. Michael's voice was urgent. "Have you seen the news?" he asked. "I have," Michael replied. "Things are moving faster. It's moving faster than we thought. I've just heard that Elena's lawyer is preparing to file a countersuit. They're trying to make you look bad in all this." Michael's jaw clenched as he thought about the allegations they're making. "Anything they can throw at you, I guess. We need to be prepared to see what sticks. It's a desperate move, but we need to be ready. I'll gather everything we have and send it over to you immediately," Michael said. His voice was resolute. Michael's phone buzzed with another message. It was from Ashlyn. "I heard about Elena's suspension. We need to talk. Same coffee shop an hour later." Michael thought for a moment before replying with a simple, "Okay." An hour later, Michael found himself back in the secluded booth of the coffee shop. Ashlyn arrived a few minutes later, her face flushed with excitement. "Can you believe it?" she said as she slid into the booth. "They actually..." Michael nodded, his face impassive. "It's just the beginning. Ashlyn, Elena won't go down without a fight." Ashlyn's eyes gleamed with a mix of anger and determination. "Let her try. We've got her cornered right now. I just got word that Elena is preparing to countersue," Michael replied, his voice low. "She's..." Ashlyn's eyes widened. "You think I'm the villain here? That's insane, after everything she's done." Michael leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Ashlyn, I need to know if there's anything else, any detail, no matter how small, that could help us build a stronger case against Elena." Ashlyn bit her lip. After a moment of hesitation, Ashlyn revealed, "There's one thing I didn't mention before because I wasn't sure, but I think Elena might have been involved with one of the other professors." Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. "Go on," he prompted. "I overheard Ian talking on the phone once. He was upset, saying something about Elena and someone named Riley. At the time, I thought maybe it was another student, but now I think it was Riley Kane." Michael was processing this new information, and Elena's colleague Ashley confirmed it. Michael replied, "It's definitely worth looking into. Thank you, Ashlyn. This could be important." As they parted ways, Michael was already thinking about how this could affect the case. Michael was already thinking about what he could do if Elena was involved with Riley K. It could change everything. Over the next few days, Michael worked hard to gather evidence and build his case. He worked closely with Gavin Henley, looking over financial records, gathering witness statements, and one evening, Michael was reviewing some documents in his home office when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Ian standing there, looking even more haggard than before. "I need to talk to you," Ian said, his voice shaky. "In what way?" Ian paced the living room, running his hands through his hair. "I can't take it anymore. The guilt, the fear, it's eating me alive." Michael watched him carefully. "What are you talking about?" "I can't keep living like this," Michael thought. If Ian makes an uncontrolled confession, it could throw everything into chaos. He needed to handle this carefully. "Ian, slow down," Michael said, keeping his voice calm. "Think about what you're saying. A rash decision now could ruin your entire future, and my future too." "Already ruined," Ian shouted. "Don't you get it? There's no coming back from this." Michael stepped closer. His voice was firm but not unkind. "There's always a way back, Ian. But you need to be smart about this. If you go to the ethics committee, tell them everything you know in a controlled manner. You have a chance at salvaging your academic career." Ian hesitated, uncertainty replacing some of the wild desperation in his eyes. "You think so?" Michael nodded. "I do, but you need to calm down and think this through. Rushing in now, in this state, will only make things worse." As he spoke, Michael's mind raced ahead, considering the implications. If Ian confesses, it could be a powerful weapon against Elena, but only if it's handled correctly. "Listen to me, Ian. Go home and get some rest. We'll talk to my lawyer tomorrow and figure out the best way to approach the ethics committee." Michael showed Ian out and said he'd think about it. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running short and he needed to accelerate his plans. The next morning, Michael met with Gavin Henley to discuss Ian's situation. "This could be a game changer," Gavin said, leaning back in his chair. "If we can get Ian to..." Michael nodded. "It would back up everything we've been saying, but we need to handle this carefully. Ian's not stable. If we push too hard, he might crack." Gavin's eyes narrowed. "Leave Ian to me. I know how to handle fragile witnesses. You focus on that." Michael left Gavin's office and got on his phone. He had a message from Ashlyn. "Emergency. Meet me at the park ASAP." Michael frowned. He had a sense of unease. He quickly made his way to the park. He found Ashlyn pacing nervously. Michael approached Ashlyn, who was standing by the lake. She looked pale, and her hands were shaking slightly. "What's wrong?" he asked. "It's Elena," she replied. "She threatened me. I never graduated. She had friends in high places who could ruin my life." Michael felt a cold anger building inside him. "Did anyone else hear this?" Ashlyn shook her head no. "We were alone, but Michael, I'm scared. What if she follows through?" Michael placed a reassuring hand on Ashlyn's shoulder. "She won't. I won't let her. In fact, this might be exactly what we need to bring her down for good." As he comforted Ashlyn, Michael was already thinking about a new plan. Elena's threat could be the final piece of evidence they needed to destroy her credibility completely. Over the next few days, Michael worked hard, coordinating with Gavin, was gathering more evidence and preparing for the final confrontation with Elena. He knew they were approaching a tipping point and was determined to come out on top. One evening, as Michael was reviewing some documents in his home office, his phone rang. It was Riley Kanane, Mr. Deo. Riley's voice was urgent. "I need to talk. It's about Elena." Michael was immediately interested. "What about her, Professor Kane Riley?" He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I have evidence of her relationships with students, multiple students, and with me." Michael felt a surge of triumph. This was exactly what they needed. "Can you meet me at my lawyer's office tomorrow morning?" "Yes," Riley replied, his voice shaky. "I'll be there." Michael ended the call, allowing himself a small, grim smile. The pieces were falling into place. Elena's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The next morning, Michael sat in Gavin Henley's office. As Riley Kane told his story, I listened to the professor's voices as he described his affair with Elena and the pattern of manipulation and abuse he had witnessed. He said, "She made me feel special." Riley looked down, but then I realized I wasn't the only one when I threatened to come forward. "She blackmailed me. She said she'd ruin my career if I ever spoke up." Gavin leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Professor Kane, are you willing to testify to this and provide a sworn statement?" Riley nodded, a look of determination replacing the shame on his face. "Yes, it's time the truth came out." Michael's phone buzzed with a message from Ian. "Can't do this anymore. Going to the ethics committee now." Michael felt a jolt of alarm. He quickly excused himself and stepped out of the office, dialing Ian's number. It went straight to voicemail. "Damn it," Michael muttered. He turned to Gavin. We need to move fast. Ian's about to confess to the ethics committee." Gavin nodded and reached for his phone. "I'll call them now and try to get us in there before he arrives." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Michael and Gavin raced to the university and arrived just as Ian was being escorted into the ethics committee hearing. "Room, wait," Michael called out. "We have new evidence that the committee needs to hear." Dr. Evelyn Reeves, the committee chairwoman, looked between Michael and Ian, her brow furrowed. "This is highly irregular," she said. "I understand." Michael said his voice was calm but firm. "I promise you, what we have to say will change." After a moment, Dr. Reeves nodded and said, "Let's hear what you have to say for the next hour." Michael and Gavin presented their case, laying out the evidence of Elena's multiple affairs, her manipulation of students and colleagues, and her attempts to silence those who threatened to expose her. He looked pale and shaken as he backed up their story, going into detail about his own relationship with Elena and how it had affected him. Dr. Reeves looked visibly shaken as the hearing wrapped up. "This is more serious than we thought. We'll need time to look over all this new evidence. I can assure you we'll take appropriate action." As they left the hearing room, Michael felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The truth was finally coming to light, but his victory was short-lived. When they stepped out of the building, they found Elena waiting for them. Her face was a mask of fury. She was glaring at Michael. She seemed to think she'd won, but she was wrong. This was only the beginning. Michael met her gaze evenly. "It's over, Elena. The truth is out there, and there's nowhere left for you to hide." Elena laughed bitterly. "You have no idea what I'm capable of. Michael, you've made a powerful enemy today. I promise you, you'll regret it." As Elena stormed off, Michael watched her go, a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. He had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Gavin placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "We did it," he said. "Michael, we got her on the ropes." Michael nodded, his face set in grim determination. "For now." But Elena was right about one thing's for sure: this isn't over. We need to be prepared for whatever she throws at us next. As they walked away from the university, Michael's mind was already racing ahead, planning his next moves. He'd come this far, made so many sacrifices, and there was no turning back now. The war with Elena had entered a new phase, and Michael, he was set on seeing it through to the bitter end, whatever the cost. He would have his cold retribution. It had been a week since the ethics committee hearing, and the fallout was still unfolding. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Gavin Henley. Michael's voice was tense. "We got a problem. A big one." Michael straightened in his chair. "What's going on? It's Ian Gavin. He's not well. I just heard he had a breakdown last night. He's in the hospital now." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of breakdown?" Gavin hesitated before answering. "It's not just that either." Before he was admitted, he sent an email to the ethics committee saying that he'd recanted his testimony. Michael was taken aback for a moment as he absorbed this information. Gavin says that he was pressured into lying and that Elena never did anything wrong. "Michael, this could blow our whole case apart." Michael's mind raced, considering the implications. "We need to keep this under control. Can you get in touch with the doctors and find out what's going on?" See if we can talk to him. I'm on it, Gavin replied. But there's more. Elena's lawyer has contacted us. They're pushing for an emergency hearing with the ethics committee. They're going to try to use Ian's recantation to discredit everything we've presented. Michael's jaw clenched. When's the hearing tomorrow morning? It's 000 a.m. Right, Michael said, his voice firming with resolve. We need to move fast. Give me everything you can on Ian's condition, and set up a meeting with Ashlyn and Professor Kane. We need to make sure they're prepared for what's coming. As he ended the call, Michael's gaze fell on the framed photo. Michael picked up a photo of Elena, who he'd knocked face down weeks ago. He was studying the smiling face of the woman he'd once loved, the woman who was now his mortal enemy. You won't win, Elena, he murmured. Not this time. He was lying in the bed, pale and drawn. His wrists were bandaged, and there was a police officer standing guard outside the door. It was Mr. Deo. Ian's voice was weak, and his eyes were unfocused. I'm sorry, I couldn't do it anymore, he said. Your testimony. Ian's eyes darted around the room nervously. She got to me. Elena said that if I didn't take it all back, she'd make sure I never worked again. She has connections and people who could ruin me. Michael felt a surge of anger, quickly suppressed. Ian, listen to me. Elena can't hurt you anymore, but we need your help. The ethics committee is having another hearing tomorrow. If you don't tell the truth, everything we've fought for will be lost. We need your help, Ian. The ethics committee is having another hearing tomorrow. If you don't tell the truth, everything we've fought for will be lost. Tears welled up in Ian's eyes. I can't face her again. I'm not strong enough. Michael leaned in, his voice low and intense. Ian, you've made it through everything she's thrown at you. This is your chance to finally break free and take back control of your life. Ian paused, a look of conflict on his face. What do I need to do? Just tell the truth, Michael replied. We'll be there with you, every step of the way. As Michael left the hospital, his phone buzzed with a message from Ashlyn. Emergency. Elena cornered me again. Meet at the coffee shop. Michael's jaw clenched as he read the message. He quickly replied, On my way. 20 minutes later, Michael slid into the now familiar booth across from me. Ashlyn's face was pale and her hands were shaking slightly as she clutched her coffee cup. Michael asked in a low, urgent voice, What happened? Michael, she was expelled. I've never seen her like that before. Michael reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Ashlyn's arm. Listen to me, Ashlyn. Elena is desperate. She's lashing out because she knows she's losing, but we can't let her intimidate us, not now. Ashlyn nodded, her cheeks returning some color. You're right. I know you're right. It's just that it's all so overwhelming. I know, Michael replied, his voice softening slightly. But we're close, Ashlyn. So close to ending this once and for all. I need you to be strong for just a little longer. Ashlyn replied with a look of determination replacing the fear in her eyes. Yes, I can do that, she said. As they parted ways, Michael's phone rang again. It was Riley Kane, Mr. Deo. Riley's voice was tense. We need to talk now, he said. On campus, the professor was pacing, clearly upset. Elena reached out to me. Riley said that she would reveal some indiscretions from my past if I didn't retract my statement to the ethics committee. Michael's eyes narrowed. What kind of indiscretions? Riley ran a hand through his hair, his face flushed with shame. Years ago, before I came to this university, I had an inappropriate relationship with a graduate student. It was brief and nothing came of it. But if it got out now, Michael thought, his mind already working on how to turn it to their advantage. Professor C, listen to me. Elena is bluffing. She's throwing everything she has at the wall, hoping something will stick. But we can use this. Riley looked up, confusion clear on his face. How can we use it? Michael replied. We go to the ethics committee first thing tomorrow morning. You tell them everything about your past indiscretion about Elena's blackmail attempt. We frame it as Elena's desperate attempt to silence you. Riley hesitated, uncertainty clouding his features. But my career will be fine. Michael assured him. The committee will see this for what it is. You coming clean, taking responsibility for past mistakes. It will make your testimony against Elena even more credible. Riley's face cleared. First thing tomorrow morning, you tell the committee everything about your past indiscretion and Elena's blackmail attempt. We'll frame it as Elena's desperate attempt to silence you." Riley hesitated, uncertainty clouding his features, but Michael assured him the committee will see this for what it is. You coming clean and taking responsibility for past mistakes will make your testimony against Elena even more credible. As understanding dawned on Riley's face, Michael felt a grim satisfaction. Every move Elena made was backfiring and pushing them closer to victory. The next morning, Michael stood outside the ethics committee hearing room with his allies. Ian looked pale but determined. Ashlyn had her chin held high despite the fear in her eyes. Riley Kane was nervous but resolved. Michael had told them all to stick to the truth. Elena would try to rattle them to make them doubt themselves. They had a fact on their side. As they filed into the hearing room, Michael caught sight of Elena sitting at the other table. Their eyes met, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the woman he'd once loved. It was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Dr. Evelyn Reeves called the hearing to order. Her voice was grave in light of recent developments. "We've convened this emergency session to reassess the case against Professor Elena Deo. Mr. Henley, you may begin." Gavin stood, his presence commanding the room. "Thank you, Dr. Reeves. We're here today because the truth is under attack. Professor Deo has engaged in a campaign of intimidation and blackmail, attempting to silence those who would speak out against her. But today, those voices will be heard over the next 2 hours." Michael watched as Ian, Ashlyn, and Riley took the stand. Each of them spoke clearly and confidently, detailing Elena's manipulation, her threats, and her abuse of power. When it was Elena's turn to present her defense, she stood, her composure cracking slightly. "These allegations are absurd," she began, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "Mr. Deo has orchestrated this entire charade out of jealousy and spite. He's manipulated these poor, confused students into believing that's enough." Michael interrupted, standing. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "For weeks, you've tried to paint yourself as you're the predator here. You've used your position to manipulate and abuse students for years, and now you're finally going to face the consequences." Elena's face contorted with rage. "You sanctimonious bastard," she hissed. "You think you've won? You have no idea. What I'm capable of, I'll destroy you, Michael. I'll do the same to Mrs. Deo and Dr. Reeves. That's quite enough. This committee will take a recess to deliberate. We'll reconvene in an hour with our decision." As they filed out of the hearing room, Michael felt a hand on his arm. He turned to find Ian. He looked at him, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Ian," he said softly, "for believing in me, for helping me find the strength to do this." Michael nodded, allowing himself a small smile. "You stood up to her. You should be proud of yourself." The next hour passed in intense silence. Michael paced the hallway, his mind racing through every possible outcome. When they were finally called back into the hearing room, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. Dr. Reeves cleared her throat, her face grave. After careful consideration of all the evidence, she began to speak. "The committee has reached a unanimous decision. Professor Elena Deo, you are hereby stripped of your tenure and dismissed from this university, effective immediately. Furthermore, we will be referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges." The room erupted in a flurry of activity, but Elena's anguished cry was drowned out by the sound of cameras clicking and reporters clamoring for statements. Throughout it all, Michael stood still, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over him as they left the hearing room. Gavin clapped Michael on the shoulder. He said, a rare smile crossing his face. "It's over," Michael said, shaking his head. "But there's still the divorce to finalize." 2 weeks later, Michael found himself in a courtroom facing Elena across the aisle. The divorce proceedings had been contentious, with Lena fighting for every penny she could get. As the judge entered, Michael straightened in his seat. This was the final battle in the matter of Deo versus Deo. The judge began, his voice resonating through the courtroom. He had reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented. "I'm ready to render my decision," he said. "My Michael." He held his breath, acutely aware of Elena's glare. Given the circumstances surrounding the dissolution of this marriage, particularly the ethical violations and potential criminal behavior of Mrs. Deo, He found in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Michael Deo. He also denied Mrs. Deo's claim to marital assets. Furthermore, Mr. Deo is awarded spousal support given the damage to his reputation caused by Mrs. Deo's actions. Elena was outraged and cried, "This is insane, you can't do this." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Mrs. Deo, control yourself or I'll hold you in contempt. This court's decision is final." As they stood to leave, Elena approached. Michael, her face a mask of fury and desperation, said, "You've ruined me. Are you happy now?" "You took everything from me," Michael replied, his voice cold. "You betrayed our marriage, abused your position and manipulated and hurt others for your own gain. This is simply the consequence of your actions." As Elena was led away by her lawyer, Michael felt a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved, certainly, and felt a grim satisfaction at seeing justice served, but also a deep sadness for what might have been. Gavin approached a stack of papers in his hand. "It's done. The divorce is final. You're a free man." Michael nodded, took a deep breath, and said, "Thank you, Gavin, for everything." As they left the courthouse, Michael paused on the steps and looked out over the city for the first time in months. He felt a sense of possibility of a future unburdened by the weight of betrayal and revenge. "What now?" Gavin asked, following Michael's gaze. Michael allowed himself a small smile. Now we build something new." 6 months later, Michael stood in the sleek conference room of his new tech startup, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The company had taken off faster than he'd ever imagined. He dared to hope, driven by the innovative software he developed during those long nights when sleep was elusive. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Ashlyn, now his business partner and head of marketing. "Michael, the investors are here for the presentation," he said. "I'll be right there," Michael replied, gathering his materials. He saw a news article open on his computer. The headline read, "Former university professor pleads guilty to multiple counts of sexual misconduct." Michael allowed himself to remember the pain, the anger, and the cold determination that had driven him for so long. Then he closed the browser and shut away the past. He had a new life now and a new purpose. The man who, when he walked into the conference room, he wasn't the broken, betrayed husband of 6 months ago. He was stronger now, more resilient and focused on the future. As he began his presentation, Michael felt a sense of pride and accomplishment wash over him. He had faced his darkest hour and emerged victorious. Now finally he was ready to move forward, leaving the shadows of the past behind.